John had always led a simple life. A man in his early 30s, he worked a 9-to-5 job at a small office downtown. His days were spent answering emails, attending meetings, and handling mundane tasks that barely seemed to make a difference. In the grand scheme of things, he had no exciting hobbies, no thrilling adventures. He was content, or at least he thought he was. The truth was, deep down, there was a yearning within him, an unspoken longing for something more, something beyond the ordinary. But John didn't know how to find it, nor did he know what it would look like when it came. It was just a feeling, a quiet restlessness that he tried to ignore as he got lost in the routine of his daily life. One evening, after a particularly tiring day at work, John returned home to find something unusual. As he unlocked the door to his small apartment, his eyes were drawn to a white envelope resting on the doormat. At first, he thought it was just another piece of junk mail or an advertisement, but there was something about it that caught his attention. The envelope had no return address, no stamps, and no markings. It was simply plain white, with a deep red wax seal in the corner. John bent down and picked it up, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. He didn't know why, but something about the way it was placed there made his heart beat a little faster. He had no idea who could have sent it or why. Inside the envelope there was a single piece of paper. As he unfolded it, the message written in elegant flowing script caught his eye. "Come to the old mansion on Willow Street at midnight. You won't regret it." The words were short, mysterious, and left John feeling intrigued. There was no signature, no explanation, just an invitation. He stared at the paper for a moment, his mind racing with questions. Who would send such an invitation? What kind of event could it be? And why did it feel so urgent? It was clear that whoever had sent it expected him to show up. At first, John thought about throwing the letter away. He had no idea what this was about, and it could be some kind of prank. But as the hours passed, the idea of going to the mansion lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the mystery of the invitation that intrigued him. It was the possibility of something different, something out of the ordinary. He felt as though he had been given a chance to break away from his predictable life, a chance to escape the dullness of his daily routine and experience something thrilling. Around 11:30 p.m., John found himself standing in front of the old mansion. He had Googled Willow Street and found the address. The mansion was located on the outskirts of the city, near the woods. It looked abandoned, its large, dark windows staring down at him like empty eyes. The house seemed as though it had been forgotten by time, standing alone in the dark with its faded exterior and overgrown ivy creeping up the stone walls. The street was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. John hesitated for a moment, staring at the house. Was this a mistake? Was it safe to enter? His mind raced with doubts and concerns, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. There was something about the place, something unsettling yet inviting, that made him feel as if he had to go inside. He took a deep breath and walked up the steps to the front door. The large wooden door stood before him, and as he raised his hand to knock, the door creaked open by itself, almost as if it were expecting him. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he stood frozen on the doorstep, unsure of what to do. But before he could reconsider, a soft voice called from inside. "You're just in time," the voice said, smooth and welcoming. John stepped inside, his curiosity overcoming his hesitation. A woman stood in the hallway, her figure silhouetted by the soft glow of candlelight. She was tall, with long, dark hair that flowed down her back like silk. Her dress was black, simple yet elegant, and she had an air of mystery about her. She didn't seem at all surprised to see him, as if she had been expecting him all along. "Come in," she said, her smile warm but knowing. "We've been waiting for you." John wasn't sure what to say or how to respond. He had expected some kind of party, maybe a gathering of strange people, but the woman's calm demeanor made him feel oddly at ease. She stepped aside, and John hesitated only for a moment before walking into the mansion. The door clicked shut behind him, and he realized he had no way of leaving without her knowing. As he walked through the dark hallway, John noticed that he wasn't alone. 3 other women stood nearby, their faces partially obscured by shadows. Each one was dressed in black, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of interest and something more, something deeper. As John stepped further into the mansion, the door clicked shut behind him, a soft but final sound that seemed to echo throughout the vast, dimly lit hallway. The woman who had greeted him, tall and graceful, led the way without saying another word. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes. John found himself instinctively following her, his mind racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. His heart was beating faster now, the sound of it almost deafening in the silence that hung in the air. The house was cold, despite the warmth that the candlelight should have provided. The walls were adorned with old, faded portraits that seemed to watch him with piercing eyes, their expressions frozen in time. The floor creaked underfoot as he walked, the sound reverberating in the stillness, heightening his sense of unease. But there was something about the place that also felt oddly captivating, as if he had stumbled into a different world, one that was not quite real, but somehow more alive than anything he had ever experienced. As they moved deeper into the mansion, John caught sight of the other women. They were standing off to the side, their gazes fixed on him as they stood silently in the shadows. It was almost as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him to do something. His breath caught in his throat as he looked at them. They were beautiful, each one in a way that made his pulse race. They stood in stark contrast to the woman who had greeted him, who was poised and elegant. But they all exuded a quiet power, a magnetic allure that made it impossible for John to look away. The first woman, the one who had opened the door for him, turned and smiled at him as she moved through the hallway. Her smile was soft, but there was something in the curve of her lips that hinted at something more, something mysterious, even dangerous. Her dark eyes sparkled with an unreadable emotion, making John feel as though she could see straight through him. She gestured toward the others with a subtle nod. "These are my companions," she said in a voice that was both gentle and commanding. "And they, like me, have been waiting for you." John tried to swallow the knot that had formed in his throat, unsure of what to say. "Waiting for me?" he asked, his voice sounding small in the grand silence of the mansion. "Why?" The woman's smile deepened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied cryptically. "But first, come with me. The evening has just begun." She moved forward, her movements graceful and deliberate, as though she were gliding across the floor. John followed her, compelled by a strange pull he couldn't quite understand. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, its labyrinthine hallways leading him deeper into the heart of the unknown. The air grew heavier with each step, the sense of mystery thickening around him like a fog. They reached a large circular room at the end of the hall, where a fire crackled in the fireplace. The flames danced in the dark, casting flickering shadows across the walls and floor. It was an inviting room, with plush armchairs scattered around, soft rugs beneath them, and the scent of incense hanging in the air. The mood was warm and intimate, but there was also an edge to it, a sense that anything could happen. The woman gestured toward one of the chairs. "Please sit," she said, her voice still calm, but laced with an underlying authority. John sat down, his mind still spinning with confusion and curiosity. The other women moved silently around him, each of them taking up a position in the room. Their gazes were unwavering, as though they were studying him, sizing him up. He felt exposed, yet oddly comfortable, as though he had been placed in the center of something that was meant for him, and only him. One of the women, a redhead with striking emerald eyes, approached him first. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she knelt in front of him. Her face was close to his now, and her scent, a heady mix of jasmine and something more elusive, filled his senses. "You've come a long way, John," she said softly, her voice like velvet. "You're here for more than just an invitation." "Aren't you?" John swallowed hard, his heart racing. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to pull away, to escape this strange situation. But another part of him was captivated by her presence, by the warmth of her gaze. It was as though she could see right into his soul, and for a fleeting moment, he felt as though she understood him better than anyone ever had. Before he could respond, the blonde woman stepped forward. She was taller than the redhead, with a cool, calculating air about her. Her blue eyes were sharp, almost piercing, and she studied him with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being dissected. As John sat in the plush chair, surrounded by the women in the dimly lit room, the sense of anticipation thickened in the air. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the stone walls. The warmth from the flames contrasted sharply with the cold chill that seemed to grip John's heart. He still wasn't entirely sure what he had gotten himself into, but the curiosity that had drawn him here now flared up, and it was all he could focus on. The woman with the dark hair, who had greeted him and led him into the mansion, moved closer, her soft steps making no sound against the floor. Her eyes, dark and intense, never left his face as she spoke. "We told you earlier that we've been waiting for you," she began, her voice smooth and measured. "But we didn't just bring you here for no reason. We want to play a game, John. A game that will reveal things about you that you've never known." John's chest tightened. A game? He didn't know how to feel. The whole situation was surreal, and a part of him was still thinking about leaving. But he stayed. There was something in her gaze, something compelling that made him want to hear her out. The redhead, who had been standing quietly off to the side, now stepped forward. Her emerald eyes gleamed with mischief as she leaned down, her lips brushing close to John's ear as she spoke. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We're not going to hurt you. We're simply going to help you see what's inside you. Let go of your doubts. Trust us. And we'll show you how to embrace the truth that's been buried deep within you." John shivered slightly, feeling the warmth of her breath on his skin. He wanted to ask more questions, but something inside him told him to remain silent, to wait and see what would unfold. As the redhead backed away, the blonde woman took her place. She was taller than the rest, her presence sharp and undeniable. Her blue eyes pierced through him as she crouched down, her face mere inches from his own. "You've lived your life like most others," she said, her voice low and commanding. "You've followed the rules, played by the game others set for you. But we're going to show you that there's more. There's a side of you, John, that's been asleep for far too long. We're here to wake it up." Her words sent a thrill through John, stirring something deep inside him that he couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive, as though something was unlocking within him, something that had been hidden, even from himself. But at the same time, a deep fear began to rise, fear of what he might discover. "We're not just going to talk," the blonde continued. "You'll feel it. You'll experience it." John's heart skipped a beat as the woman stood up and motioned for the others to move. One by one, the women circled him, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. They weren't threatening. On the contrary, they were mesmerizing. Their movements were fluid, their eyes full of intent. John didn't know whether to feel fear or excitement. He felt both. The dark-haired woman, the one who had welcomed him into the mansion, approached him again. This time, she extended her hand toward him, her eyes never leaving his. "Take my hand, John," she said softly. "You've already made the choice by coming here. Now, take the next step." John hesitated for a moment, He wasn't sure what he was agreeing to, but somehow he knew he had to trust her. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand. The moment his skin touched hers, a strange warmth spread through his body, almost like electricity. It was like an invisible force was pulsing between them, charging the air with an energy he couldn't understand. The woman smiled as she led him to his feet. "Good," she said. "Now you're ready." John looked around, unsure of what would happen next. The room had grown even more still, if that was possible, and yet it felt charged with an undercurrent of possibility. The fire flickered in the corner, but the silence seemed deafening. The redhead moved forward once more, standing just a few feet away from him. "It's time for you to let go," she said, her voice tender yet powerful. "Stop thinking. Stop questioning. Just feel. What we have to show you is beyond words. Trust in the experience." John couldn't respond. He was caught up in her gaze, mesmerized by the way she looked at him, as if she already knew everything about him, as if she understood his every desire, every fear. And for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. The blonde woman stepped. Up next, her piercing blue eyes now softening with a hint of something else. She placed her hand on John's shoulder, a touch that was gentle but strong. "Let go of everything you think you know about yourself, John. Let us show you who you really are." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows around the room, yet the air had grown dense, charged with an electricity John could hardly ignore. His pulse was racing, his body still vibrating from the kiss, the touch, the warmth of the women surrounding him. The dark-haired woman, the one who had first greeted him, had taken him into a moment that felt beyond time. He couldn't quite explain what had just happened, but it was as if a barrier had been shattered within him, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and yet strangely free. As he stood there, trying to catch his breath, the redhead, who had been quietly observing, approached him. Her emerald eyes locked with his, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. She didn't say a word at first. Instead, she simply stepped closer, her presence commanding the room. "You're awake now, aren't you, John?" she asked, her voice low and teasing, as if she were speaking to someone who had just stepped into a new world. John swallowed hard, still unsure of how to respond. He was overwhelmed, caught between confusion and exhilaration. The intensity of what he had just experienced with the dark-haired woman had shaken him. But there was something about it that felt deeply right, like a part of him had finally been unlocked. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now, but he knew he didn't want to leave. The redhead didn't wait for him to answer. She stepped even closer, her face inches from his. Her breath was warm against his skin, and John felt his body react to her presence, to the energy between them. Without warning, she lifted a hand and gently cupped his jaw, tilting his face to meet hers. "You've been hiding from yourself for so long," she murmured, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. "You've been living in a cage, John, but tonight, we're going to help you break free." John's heart thundered in his chest. There was something so certain in her words, something that struck a chord deep inside him. He didn't understand how or why, but it was as though she had seen the deepest part of him, the part he had buried for years, and she knew exactly how to reach it. Before he could respond, the blonde woman stepped forward, her cool blue eyes fixed on him with a quiet intensity. Her gaze didn't waver as she spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "You're still holding back," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You're here now, but you're not fully here. You're still fighting. Against what's happening. Against what we're showing you." John wanted to argue, to tell her that he didn't understand what was going on, but instead, he stayed silent, unable to speak. The blonde woman moved closer, closing the distance between them. She was so near now that John could feel the heat, from her body, the warmth of her skin. Her eyes never left his as she continued, "We're going to help you let go. No more holding back. You have everything you need inside you, John. You just need to let it out." Before he could process her words, she leaned in and kissed him, softly at first, then deeper, more insistent. The kiss was different from the dark-haired woman's. It was firm, direct, and yet it held a kind of tender intensity. As her lips moved against his, John felt a deep pull within him, as if his very essence was being drawn toward hers. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was something far deeper, something that felt like an awakening. The kiss lasted longer this time, leaving John breathless and dazed when they finally broke apart. He stood there, his body aching with the sensations that still lingered from the kiss, and for a moment, everything around him seemed distant. It was as though the room, the mansion, even the women, all of it had faded away, leaving him with only the intense awareness of his own body, of his senses. He could feel every nerve tingling, every inch of his skin alive with a heightened awareness. The redhead was still watching him, her eyes glowing with satisfaction, as if she had known exactly how this would unfold. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you, John?" she whispered, her voice almost melodic. "You're beginning to see who you truly are." The dark-haired woman stepped forward now, her expression unreadable. "The game we're playing, John, isn't just about pleasure," she said softly. "It's about breaking through the walls you've built around yourself. The walls that keep you from living fully, from feeling completely." John's breath caught in his throat. The words resonated deep within him, stirring something he couldn't put into words. He had lived his life in a constant state of control, of following the rules, never allowing himself to fully experience life. Now, here he was, in this strange mansion, surrounded by women who seemed to understand him better than he understood himself. The air in the room seemed to hum with an almost tangible energy, as if the very walls were alive with anticipation. John stood at the center of it all, surrounded by the women who had drawn him into this world. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across their faces, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. The intensity of the moment was undeniable, the weight of his decision heavy on his chest. His body still hummed with the sensations from the kiss and the touch of the dark-haired woman, the blonde, the redhead. Each of them had brought something out of him, something that had been locked away for so long. Now, as the silence stretched, he felt the tension building inside him. He had let go of his doubts and fears, but the next step was still unclear. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but there was a part of him that wasn't scared anymore. The mystery felt thrilling. The blonde woman moved toward him first, her steps deliberate and confident. She had a presence about her. That was commanding. Yet there was something softer in her gaze now. She stopped just inches from him, her blue eyes locked with his. For a moment, they simply stood there, the world around them fading as their connection deepened. "You're ready, John," she said, her voice calm yet intense like a quiet storm. "You've broken through your hesitation, but now comes the hardest part. Let yourself be free. Let go of everything that holds you back." John's chest tightened, but he didn't pull away. She was right. He had already taken the first step, by being here, by embracing the unknown. But now it was time to truly release himself, to trust in the process. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be something transformative. The redhead, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with a soft smile playing on her lips. Her emerald eyes gleamed as she walked towards him, her every movement graceful, almost hypnotic. She reached out, gently touching his arm as she stood before him. "Trust us," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. We won't let you fall." Her touch was light, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. John's breath caught in his throat as she drew even closer. He could feel the magnetic pull between them, a connection that went beyond physical attraction. It was deeper, more profound. The redhead placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. "You've been running from yourself, from the truth inside you," she continued, her voice soothing, yet filled with authority. "But we're here to help you stop running. You deserve to feel everything, every emotion, every desire, every part of you that you've kept hidden away." John's heart was pounding, each word she spoke resonating deep within him. He had spent so much of his life building walls around himself, protecting parts of him that he was afraid to face. But here, in this room, surrounded by these women, he felt like those walls were beginning to crumble. For the first time, he felt like he could truly breathe, like he could finally be himself. The dark-haired woman, who had always held a mysterious, almost regal presence, moved closer to him. Now, her gaze was piercing, yet there was something comforting in her eyes as she spoke. "You don't have to hide anymore, John," she said softly. "You've already begun the process. Now, let yourself be completely open. Let go of the fear of what you might find. Let go of the judgment you've placed on yourself." John's body tensed as her words sank in. Let go. It was simple, but it felt like the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. He had spent so many years trying to control everything, trying to keep his emotions, his desires in check. But now, in this moment, he realized that control had only kept him locked in a cage of his own making. The dark-haired woman's hand slid up to his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. She leaned in slightly, her lips brushing against his ear, as she spoke again. "Let the release come, John. Feel it. Embrace it." John's pulse quickened as her words washed over him, and something inside him shifted. The tension that had been building in him for so long, years perhaps, finally broke. It was as if a dam had burst open, and everything he had been holding back came rushing to the surface. The flood of emotion, of desire, of longing. It was overwhelming, yet freeing at the same time. The women stood around him, their presence enveloping him like a cocoon. They didn't need to say anything more. It was as if they knew exactly what he needed, knew that this was the moment of release. The moment when he would shed his fears and doubts and step into something new. The room was silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. John's chest rose and fell with each breath, his body still alive with the intensity of the moments that had just passed. His mind swirled with emotions, a mixture of excitement, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of liberation. For the first time, he truly felt free. Free from the constraints he had placed on himself, free from the years of hiding parts of himself that had never been allowed to fully surface. But now, as he stood in the presence of these women, something was stirring inside him. It wasn't just the release he had felt moments before. It was a transformation, a shift in who he was, who he had always been, and what he was now ready to embrace. The blonde woman, who had stood quietly observing, now moved toward him. Her presence was undeniable, her movements graceful yet strong. She stood before him, her blue eyes piercing through him as if she were seeing not just the surface, but deep into the very core of who he was. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she simply studied him, her gaze heavy with meaning. John could feel the weight of her stare, but rather than feeling exposed or vulnerable, he felt a strange sense of comfort. There was no judgment in her eyes, only an understanding that seemed to go beyond words. The air between them crackled with energy, and he felt his body respond to her, every inch of his skin alive with a heightened awareness. "You've come so far, John," she said finally, her voice low yet filled with conviction. "You've let go of your fear, your doubts, your insecurities. But now, it's time for something deeper. It's time to embrace who you truly are." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. But instead of feeling afraid, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. He had already surrendered so much of himself in the past few hours, but now it seemed like the next step was something even bigger, something that would require him to fully embrace the transformation taking place within him. John swallowed, hard, unsure of what to say or do. He was still trying to process everything, the intense emotions, the kisses, the touch, the release. But it all felt so right. He had never allowed himself to be this open, this vulnerable, and yet he couldn't help but feel like he was on the verge of something extraordinary. The redhead, who had been standing just a few steps away, took a step forward. Her emerald eyes glistened with an unspoken understanding. She smiled softly at him, a knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge the journey he had already begun. "You've shed the layers, John," she said, her voice calm yet filled with intensity. "You've let go of your walls. Now, you have the chance to discover what lies beneath. You have the chance to awaken to your true self. No more hiding. No more running." John's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at her. He knew she was right. He had come so far, but there was something within him that was still waiting to be fully unlocked. The women around him had already helped him break through the first barriers, but now it was as if he was being asked to embrace the deepest parts of himself, the parts he had buried for so long. The dark-haired woman, who had been the first to guide him into this strange new world, stepped forward now, her eyes soft but filled with purpose. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You've already stepped into a new version of yourself," she said, her voice gentle but sure. "But the transformation isn't just about what we've shown you. It's about what you are ready to see within yourself. You've broken free of your fears, but now you must allow yourself to be transformed." John felt his pulse quicken. The transformation. It was a concept that felt almost unreal. But as he stood in the midst of these women who had seen something in him that he had never allowed himself to see, it began to make sense. This wasn't just about pleasure. It wasn't just about release. It was about reclaiming parts of himself he had buried, parts of himself he had never fully embraced. It was about stepping into a version of himself that had always been waiting, just beneath the surface. The dark-haired woman's fingers traced lightly along his arm, sending a ripple of sensation through his body. "Feel it, John," she said softly. "Feel the transformation. Let it wash over you." And as her words sank in, John did feel it. It started as a subtle shift within him, a deep stirring that seemed to come from the very core of his being. His chest tightened, his heart raced, and the emotions that had been building inside him came flooding to the surface. It wasn't just physical desire. It was an awakening of everything he had been holding back. His dreams, his fears, his passions. It was like a dam had broken within him, and everything that had been locked away for so long was rushing out. John stood in the center of the room, a man transformed. The sensations still rippled through his body. Each touch, each kiss, each whisper from the women who had guided him into this new version of himself. The fire in the hearth flickered, its warm glow casting long shadows on the walls. But for John, the warmth he felt now was not from the fire. It came from deep within, from the stirring of emotions and desires that had once been buried, but were now free. The women who surrounded him were no longer strangers. They had become his guides, his catalysts, helping him peel back the layers of fear and hesitation that had kept him confined for so long. They had unlocked something inside him, something raw and real, that he had never allowed himself to embrace. Now, in this moment, he felt like he had reached the final stage of his journey. The transformation was complete. But what came next was the most important part. He had to fully understand and embrace the new version of himself, without hesitation, without fear. The blonde woman, who had been a steady presence throughout this entire experience, was the first to step forward. Her cool blue eyes, which had always been intense, now softened with something that resembled pride. She placed a hand on his chest, just over his heart, and looked up at him. "You've come so far, John," she said quietly, her voice filled with warmth. But the final step is the most crucial one. John's heart raced, not from fear, but from anticipation. He had already allowed himself to be vulnerable, to embrace his desires and emotions, but the blonde woman was right. This final step was about fully stepping into his truth, without looking back, without second-guessing himself. "Embrace it, John," she continued, her fingers tracing lightly along his chest. "Everything you are, everything you've become. In these moments, let it all flow freely. It's time for you to see yourself as you truly are, without any shame, without any doubt." The redhead, who had always been so attuned to his needs, moved beside him. Her emerald eyes gleamed with understanding, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. She reached out, gently touching his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. "This is your unveiling, John. The moment you fully understand who you are and what you're capable of. You've been holding back for too long. Now, it's time to embrace your full potential." John swallowed hard, his mind swirling with the weight of her words. It was as though everything he had been afraid to face, everything he had been running from, was coming to the surface. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in his life, he was not afraid of who he was. He was not afraid of what he might become. He had already crossed the threshold, already embraced the parts of himself that had once been hidden. And now, standing before these women who had helped him unlock these truths, he was ready to embrace the final, most important part of the journey. The dark-haired woman, who had first led him into this world, stepped forward now. Her gaze was intense, yet there was something almost nurturing in it. She had been the one to help him release the fear and hesitation that had held him captive. She had been the one to guide him into the depths of himself, to help him understand the power of surrender, of release. Now she stood before him, her eyes soft yet filled with purpose. "You've done the work, John," she said gently, her voice like a balm. "You've broken down the walls that kept you from truly living. Now, it's time for you to see that the true power lies in being who you truly are, without apology." John nodded, his breath catching in his throat. He had already let go of so much, but now, in this moment, he understood what the dark-haired woman meant. The true power wasn't in control. It wasn't in hiding behind walls. It was in being unapologetically himself, in embracing his desires, his flaws, and his strengths. And for the first time, he was ready to do just that. The redhead smiled, as though she knew exactly what John was thinking. "You've shed the old layers, John," she whispered. "The past is no longer a part of you. Now all that remains is the person you've always been meant to be." John took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of their words settling deep inside him. The final step wasn't about doing anything more. It was about understanding that he had already become the person he was meant to be. There was no need to search for anything else. He had already found it. The power, the freedom, the strength. It was all within him. The women stepped back slightly, watching him closely. It was as if they were waiting for him to fully realize the magnitude of what had happened. John's mind cleared, and for the first time, he saw himself not as someone who had been lost, but as someone who had been on a journey to discover the truth. He wasn't broken.